Hello everybody and welcome back to another video on my channel. It is Kevin here, minis by Kev, whatever you want to call me. That's cool. So it's Valentine's Day coming up and I wish I could say that I came up with this idea based on the fact that it was Valentine's Day coming up, but honestly, it is not. I've had this idea for 7 or 8 months and I just hadn't done it. And I was finally like, I can make this a Valentine's Day themed thing, kind of, right? So I'm gonna do it. I had this really vivid memory of watching Hey Arnold when I was a kid, and there was a whole scene where they go through a tunnel of love, and if I remember correctly, they don't end up with who they wanted to or something. It's been a long time, but I have this really vivid memory in my head of that show, and I really wanted to recreate the tunnel of love. I Googled it, and like there's some back and forth on like whether or not these actually existed in the way people think that they existed, whether the tunnel of loves had the swans or if the swans were like an addition made up for pop culture. There's just a lot of interesting things about it, but I decided I wanted to make it. But I wanted to make it abandoned because these things just, to me, there's something about the idea of like love and bright colors, but then also it being abandoned. It's actually kind of why I like when people get traditional style tattoos of spiderwebs, but with the heart in the middle. There's just something about like love, but like in a way you wouldn't normally think about it. So to start off this mini diorama I'm making, I had to start with the swan boat. So let's go ahead and I'll turn the camera around and we're gonna start working on the swan boat. Like I said at the beginning, I have had this planned for a really long time, so I drew this out in my giant sketchbook so I could have a vague idea of how big I wanted it to be when it was done. When I first started out, I wasn't sure if I wanted to make this out of mat board, if I wanted to use popsicle sticks or basswood, or the material was kind of just all up in the air. So I decided to start off by making a little like prop version, which was just out of old pasta boxes. I just glued them together and decided to make basically, like I said, like a little prop version, so that way I had an idea of like the shape I was going for, maybe some techniques I would need to use, and what kind of material I think would work best in the long run. I hastily threw this all together by hot gluing a bunch of it, and I didn't really care what it looked like because it didn't need to be pretty. It just needed to come together so that way, again, I had some kind of prop idea to go off of in the long run. So this thing is super ugly. I actually still have it, and I don't know what I'm gonna do with it because it's covered in hot glue, and it looked like crap. But it's okay because it's not the finished product, so. Here I'm showing you that I forgot to leave a space to put in the swan head at the front, and I needed to cut off the front to slot it in. I had to cut this multiple times because I kept messing up where exactly the swan head was going to go in. I think I just wasn't paying enough attention, doing the right math, I'm not sure, but I had to cut it a couple of different times and glue it back together to finally get the mess that it ends up being in the end. While it may not have ended up looking pretty, I am glad I did it because it gave me an idea of the space I would need inside of the boat. I was a little nervous about like the bench and stuff, so I'm happy I did it, even though it looks like a cardboard hot glue mess. While mat board isn't super expensive, it's not super cheap either. So I spent a long time trying to get this perfect because I like to try and use every little bit of the mat board I can use. I saved the cutoffs and stuff for other stuff, and I wanted to have it look right. I didn't want to screw up a big chunk of this boat right off the bat. So as you can see here, I took a really long time just getting the measurements right and everything, so that way in the end, the bottom of the boat ended up exactly how I wanted it to. I was basically just doing like cross hatches across to try and find the exact middle. That way I could then draw the boat shape on top of it, which I did one side on a piece of paper as like a little template, and then I flipped it over so that way they would hopefully match on each side. To make sure that I got the exact shape and cut that I want that was clean, I had to do a lot of shallow cuts to get through the mat board. Normally I do a lot of small cuts anyway because mat board can dull down your blade, and I had to replace my blade probably like 4 or 5 times for this entire project, but for this I did have a fresh blade. I still did shallow cuts throughout, so that way it came out as sharp and clean as I wanted, and it was about this time I realized that this was smaller than I had originally planned, which ends up being okay in the end because I still think that maybe this is slightly out of scale, but it was ultimately a little bit smaller than I had planned. It is a little blurry here, but I was trying to show that I need to bend this mat board, but if you bend it traditionally, it will kind of crease, and I didn't want that to happen, so I decided to do a little experiment with this strip of mat board that was close to the same length that the side of the boat would be, and I decided to soak it in some water to see how it would bend that way, if it would crease still or if it would completely fall apart because mat board is ultimately paper. I just wanted to see how I could bend it. I also cut lines into one side so that way it would help with the creasing, hopefully, that when I bent it, it wouldn't just completely rip. And it does work if you go slowly, is what I've learned, is that you can't just bend it immediately because if you let it soak for too long and there are cuts in it, it starts to fall apart. But if you kind of work the mat board it will bend to what you want. You just have to be really careful and slow and patient with it. Here I'm just showing you how I decided to kind of block in the piece of mat board while it was still wet. I was not gluing it here. I was just doing this so that way when it dried, it would dry in the correct shape that I wanted it. When it came to curving this, I wanted to try it out before I showed you in case it didn't work correctly, but I cut a bunch of lines in this and then I put it in water for like 2 seconds and then I let it dry overnight and it kept its shape. So I'm gonna try that with the other one now and hope that it ends up the same, and I'll show you the process this time. To help me get this curve, I needed to start off by marking on the mat board at regular intervals. I believe I did like 1/4 of an inch just because I wanted it to be far enough apart that the cut lines wouldn't actually go all the way through. I was afraid if they were really close that it might just kind of disintegrate the paper base of the mat board, but I didn't want them too far apart either because I needed it to be able to bend. After scoring the mat board, I kind of worked it a little bit just to try and get it more malleable. I wasn't trying to completely bend it at that point, just to get it a little looser for when it does go in the water. It can bend even more. I measured off how much I needed to cut off because it was too long, and then I dipped it in the water and I just wrung it out. Because mat board is paper based, when it was drying, I didn't want it to disintegrate or warp weirdly because it does keep the shape that it dries in. So I knew that if it was even just a little bit out of the shape I wanted it to be, it would end up drying in just a weird shape. So I needed to put a lot of stuff around it to make sure it didn't move on my desk because it kept trying to force itself back to its original position. So I had to put a lot of stuff on it and around it just to make sure that it dried correctly. And as you can see here, as I take away all the pieces, the next morning, the mat board kept its shape. After both mat board pieces were done drying in their new positions, I wanted to dry fit them to make sure they would still fit, and then I slid a piece of mat board between the two because this was going to be the SWAN head, and I wanted to make sure that it would also fit in a dry run. When it came time to actually glue these down, I took the ship in a bottle I have to put on the bottom piece to make sure it laid flat, and I did this all on a piece of parchment paper because I didn't want it to glue to my desk, and I knew that I could peel it off parchment paper if I needed to, because ultimately the very bottom of this won't matter once it's in the final diorama. I did use a mixture of hot glue as well as tacky glue, because the hot glue would hold immediately, whereas the tacky glue would hold long term. And my issue was that while the mat board took the shape I wanted, it did kind of bend a little bit still. It wasn't perfect. So I needed glue that would hold on immediately and be able to just grab while the tacky glue did its job and held long term. After I was done with the two curved piece, I cut out a third piece that was just the flat mat board, and I used that to finish off the boat in the back. As you can see here, I'm gluing it on, and this is just the base of the boat being finished and complete. Not painted, but mostly complete. When it came time to do the SWAN head and neck, I liked the version that I had already done in my sketchbook, and I didn't really like how the pasta box version ended up. So I decided I'm just going to recreate the version from my sketchbook. I broke out my old Cricut light box and I traced the head so that way I could have the shape and I could recreate it on mat board. After the tracing was done, I went ahead and cut it out so I could put it into the boat on a dry fit, just see what it looked like, make sure everything looked okay. And honestly, at this point, it was looking like a sad duck. I believe it was about this time that I switched out the blade, either for the second or third time, because when I was doing the round cuts, I wanted it to be very sharp. I was trying not to go with an accidental beveled edge, and I'm honestly not very good at holding my blade directly up and down, just like straight up and down. So that's why I use a ruler a lot when cutting, but I knew that with the round shapes, I would need a sharp blade and I need to go slow. So I did very shallow cuts around this. I think it took me like 3 or 4 go-arounds to actually cut all the way through the mat board to get it where I wanted it. Once the head and neck were free from the little mat board prison, I went ahead and did another dry fit just to make sure everything would be good. I recommend doing a lot of dry fits as you go just because it's better to know before you start gluing stuff that stuff isn't working. Another dry fit, and then I jumped right ahead and started gluing it all in. Once I knew for sure it was all gonna fit. Here I cut out 2 squares. This is going to make up the back cushion of the bench. You can see the little dowel here, and I was trying to measure out to make sure that everything looked okay. I got this at like a thrift store once, and it's like a dollhouse scale, so it's like perfect for 1/12 scale things. Instead of gluing those in, I started building the rest of the bench because I knew that I wanted to wrap the actual bench pieces with fabric, and I needed to glue in everything that needed to be glued in so that way I wouldn't get glue all over the fabric, because if you don't know, you get glue on fabric and it's going to show. And while this is going to be distressed eventually, I wanted to be in control of the distressing later. I figured it was finally time to put on this front piece, so again I did a mixture of tacky glue as well as hot glue to make sure that it had a short hold as well as a long hold, and I just glued it on. I don't show it here, but off camera I did make a paper template similar to the SWAN head for the wings. I wanted them to be the same shape on each side, so I just made it in paper and then traced it and cut it out same way I did with the SWAN head. And it was at this point that I realized after I cut this out and cut off the other one, that it looked like I had a pair of Sonic the Hedgehogs with me. These do not look like swan wings currently. But I do hold them up so you can see what they're going to look like. I am going to bend them a little bit to fit the boat. And classic me, I can't show you anything unless I accidentally drop it. I used the same technique I used on the sides to score and dip in a little bit of water just to get these to fold. However, I only dipped these in the water for maybe a split second to just kind of get the fold because I only needed part of it to actually curve. And then I used my 1, 2, 3 blocks and put them in place to hold this down while it dried. Now, for some reason, I thought you'd be interested in watching me paint white mat board white, and so I had a really long clip here, but I'm just gonna tell you real quick what I did. I painted the whole thing with a few layers of white paint because there were some score marks and some, just overall dings from being on my craft desk, as well as one side of mat board is like an off-white color, and I wanted it all to be one uniform color. So I went ahead and painted the whole white thing even whiter. While the white paint dried, I decided to start working on the bench because I knew that when I glued this, it was also going to need to dry. There was a lot of dry time in this project, so I tried to line up whenever I could multiple dry times. So I laid this down and cut out a square from some fabric that I already had from some other project and glued it down. I made sure to put glue only on one side because I knew the bottom wouldn't show, and it didn't matter how crappy it looked. But just be aware that glue does seep through fabric and does stain it. Off camera again, I made this little box out of the back part of the seat and I just wrapped it and glued it the same way I did with the other one. This one I was a little bit more worried about because I knew if it was too bulky, it would have an issue going into the swan, and I did actually have an issue. I should have probably cut this a little bit smaller, but I didn't. I also glued in areas that I thought were going to end up showing on accident. Luckily, you can't really see it because I do fold this in kind of like a present. So it did help hide some of the glue in the long run. After I was done making the back part of the cushion and I managed to shove it in there, which again was a little difficult, I put a very thick layer of glue down here where you can't see to get the back piece stuck to it. Because at this point I was done painting the white base layer, and the only painting I had left to do after this was the face. So it was time to finish the bench. I didn't use any hot glue here, I just used tacky glue because I knew that the seat wasn't going to push back out. So I put down some tacky glue and glued down the bench. You can kind of tell what I'm doing here, kind of. Now came the totally fun and not at all stressful part of painting the swan's face. Again, I was basing it off the one from Hey Arnold, kind of, mostly off the one from Hey Arnold, and I wanted to match that face because I liked the way it looked in the show. So I started off by penciling it out to make sure that it looked good, and here I am just going back and forth making sure the two eyes looked the same size. I had some orange colors, but not the orange color I really wanted, to be honest, but I went with this saffron yellow that looked orange enough. At this point is when I thought it started to look like a goose, but the pictures I saw online of this from Hey Arnold, it had this color beak. So I was like, it might say it's yellow, but this is orange enough for me. For the eyes, I wanted them to be a slightly off-white beigey color because I was afraid that if I left them white, they wouldn't really stand out enough. And in the show, they are kind of like a beigey off-white, so I decided to go with that. However, surprisingly didn't really have a beige or an off-white or, a lighter skin tone color to use. So I had to mix a couple of different colors. I think I mixed like orange and brown and white. I also painted the lilac purple color for the eyeshadow of this one, but you can't really see it here on camera while I'm painting it. When I was done with that though, I went in with the black to try and do the outlines to make the different pieces stand out and to give the swan pupils. This was by far the most stressful part. I took forever to do this. I had to paint over and redo it a couple of times because I just was not happy with it. In the end I am, but I thought I had a steady hand until I had to do this, and then I was shaking. I was shaking so bad. So I definitely don't have the steady hand that I thought I did. This after I did the one side, I flipped it over and did the other. And again, I had to do both sides probably at least twice. One of them, I'm pretty sure I did like 3 or 4 times, especially certain parts of the face because I just wasn't happy with how it was turning out. But again, like I said, I do like it in the end. It's just, man, do I need to work on my steady hand. I don't even know how to work on that. Is there a way to work on that? But this is it. This is the end of it. And let's cut over to face cam Kevin. Here she is. When I showed it to my sister, she goes, when she only saw like just the head part, she goes, is that a porch goose? I don't know if this is a thing outside the Midwest, but at least when I was a kid, back in like the late 90s, early 2000s, people had porch geese and you would like dress them up based on the holiday. I remember, I think my grandma had one. I guess someone I'm related to had one at some point, but they were everywhere. So my sister at first thought it was a porch goose until she saw the whole boat. But overall, I love it. I learned a lot. Mat board you can bend if you're willing to do some minor surgery on it, as you saw. It was easier to work with than the wood I originally had planned. I originally planned to do this all from popsicle sticks, and I was going to bend them and soak them in water and boil them in water, and this just ended up working out so much better than I could have hoped. I mean, the head's a little wonky, but I feel like it's gonna be abandoned anyway. I mean, I obviously haven't aged it at all yet, so I don't really care that it's not perfect. There are definitely parts, if you look up close, like, I didn't realize you can't paint on top of hot glue. I mean, I guess I've done like 5 coats so far, and it's still separating. Luckily, it's in a spot you don't really see it, but I know it's there, which drives me nuts. Didn't know that was a thing though. Didn't know you couldn't paint on top of it, so something for the future to remember. But overall, like, there's like some messiness in the back, but again, once it's in the diorama, you're not gonna be able to see this. It's just, you're gonna see mostly the front. So I'm not too upset about it, but it's a little messy on the back. But overall, I kind of love her. Look at her. She's a moment. She's beautiful. Look at that. I mean, the face is a little wonky too if you look too close, but let's not look too close. So that's it for this video. I will hopefully have another one up soon where I'm going to be making the diorama that that's actually going into. It's not gonna be very large. It's just gonna be probably like 12 by 12 inches, maybe somewhere around there. I don't know. It's not gonna be a large diorama. It's just gonna be like a little vignette. Yeah, if you couldn't get enough of the swan, if you couldn't get enough of the swan, you know, make sure you follow along for the next time. That's it for this video. So if you like me or you like miniatures, make sure you hit that subscribe button below, and I will see you in my next video. Goodbye.